Darius Wade was 39 years old, a master electrician who had spent 14 years building things that other people walked through without ever looking up at the ceiling to notice. He drove an 8-year-old F-150 with a dent in the rear quarter panel that he kept meaning to fix. He wore size 11 Red Wings that were 3 years into their second resoling because they still had plenty of work left in them. He got up at 5:15 every morning. He had the coffee on and both thermoses filled before he left the house. He had been doing it that way since before he could explain why, and somewhere along the way it had just become the kind of man he was. That Thursday evening in late October, he came home to find her sitting at the kitchen table with her coat on. Her bags were already in the car. He could see the nose of her sedan through the window, parked at an angle she'd never park it when she planned to stay. She slid a folder across the table without standing up. She said she was going to stay with Marcus for a while, that she'd been honest with herself finally, and that she hoped he could understand. She did not wait for him to answer. What she uncovered next, or rather what Darius uncovered about what she had done while she was deciding to go, would cost her everything she thought she'd gained. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The coffee was ready at 5:15 in the morning. Darius knew this without checking the clock. He had spent 14 years licensed in the state of Georgia, the last 6 of them with his own company, Wade Electrical, 8 employees, bonded, insured. A client list that had grown entirely on referrals because Darius had never once needed to advertise. He ran commercial jobs and residential retrofits, a few municipal contracts. He was precise, systematic, and quiet. On a job site, he was the person subcontractors called when something wasn't adding up. Not because he was the loudest voice in the room. Because he was the one who'd already read the plans. He drove the dented F-150 because it ran well, and he'd maintained it himself. He wore the Red Wings because a good boot deserved a second life if it had one left. His tools were organized the way surgeons organize instruments, not for show, but because disorganization cost time, and time, on a job site, was money that came out of someone's hide. He had met Renee 6 years earlier at a mutual friend's cookout in Decatur. She was finishing a degree in business administration and working part-time for a real estate firm in Buckhead. She was sharp, prepared. She had opinions and wasn't shy about them, and Darius had found that appealing in a way he didn't know how to explain to people who asked. He kept his word the way some men keep score. It was just the baseline, not the achievement. He had assumed she was built the same way. That was the only mistake he ever made with Renee, and he had extended it for 4 years. He didn't know, when he came home to find her coat on and the folder waiting, that she had been making plans with Marcus Cole for 11 months. He didn't know she had been calling it practical, calling it forward-looking, calling it anything except what it was. The kitchen was quiet. The fluorescent light above the sink had a flicker he'd been meaning to fix. An easy repair, a ballast swap, 20 minutes of work, and the flicker was the only sound in the room. It felt, in the moment, like the loudest thing he'd ever heard. Renee was sitting with both hands flat on the table, which was how she sat when she had decided something and did not intend to revisit it. She had dressed that morning with care in a way that was different from how she usually dressed for a workday. Darius noticed that. He noticed it the way he noticed things, the way a small misalignment in a circuit will make itself known before you can identify it, something in the system telling you the load isn't distributed right. She said, "I need to say some things I should have said a long time ago." Darius set down his thermos on the counter. Carefully, the way he set every tool down, placed, not dropped. He said nothing. He waited. She said she'd been honest with herself finally. She said she deserved more than what this was. She said Marcus was offering her a partnership, a real one, that she had an opportunity she couldn't pass up, and that she hoped Darius would be able to see someday that this wasn't about him being insufficient. It was about her needing something she hadn't found here. The here landed differently than the rest of it. The house was his. He'd bought it 4 years before they met. He'd rewired it himself over 2 years of weekends after she moved in. A complete panel replacement, new runs throughout, every outlet grounded, every junction box accessible. He'd done it because she'd complained once that the upstairs outlets were unreliable, and he wanted her to feel settled. He hadn't thought of it since. She hadn't mentioned it since. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse her. He looked at the folder on the table. He did not open it yet. He noticed, before he said anything, that the car keys visible through the window weren't her key ring. They were too large. A single fob, no personal items attached. A car she hadn't driven before. He didn't react to it. He filed it away the way he filed things, carefully, without deciding yet what it meant. "Okay," he said. She blinked. She had prepared for more than that. He could see her adjusting. She said the folder had the paperwork she'd had drawn up, that she thought it was cleanest if they moved quickly, that she had already spoken to someone, that there were some financial matters tied to the business she needed to clarify with him at some point. "I'm not going to make this harder than it has to be," she said. "I just need you to know that I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing it because I finally had the courage to be honest." Darius picked up the folder. He did not open it. He set it under his arm the way he carried a set of plans to the truck. "I'll have someone look at this," he said. She nodded. She stood. She pulled her coat tighter. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame and said, without turning, "You've always been a good man, Darius. That was never the question. I just needed more than good." She left without looking back. He stood in his kitchen for a long time after the sound of the car disappeared. Then he put on a pot of fresh coffee. He sat down at the table. He did not open the folder. He just sat there and thought about the key fob he'd seen through the window. He did not recognize the make of the car it had come from. 4 years earlier, Renee had started her own company, a small real estate consulting firm she'd called Forward Plan Properties. She had been building toward it for 3 years before they met, and Darius had believed in it before he had any evidence that he should. He had covered her first 6 months of operating costs, $38,400, through double shifts on a commercial retrofit in Midtown that winter. He had organized the draws himself so the deposits hit cleanly at the start of each month. He hadn't said much about it. It was what you did for someone building something real. She had received it with what he recognized now as a kind of distracted appreciation. Not cold, not ungrateful. Just elsewhere, she was already planning the next move while he was still building the current foundation. He had noticed her phone angled away from him when it buzzed on weeknights. He had noticed she stopped asking about his projects around the time she started taking early morning calls that required her to step into the next room. He told himself these were the pressures of building a business. He had extended good faith because that was what he did, and because the alternative, calling it by its real name, was a thing he wasn't ready to do until she made it unavoidable. Roy Tatum, the foreman he'd known since his apprenticeship, had told him once over coffee after a job walk that Darius was the only person he trusted to actually run a punch list correctly. "You catch what other people stop looking for," Roy had said. "That's rare. A lot of people don't even know it's a skill." Darius hadn't thought much about it at the time. He'd thought about it since. That was what Renee had never understood. Until the Thursday, she sat at his table in her coat, with her bags already in the car. Her name was Celestine Pruitt. She was 62 years old, a retired paralegal who had spent 31 years at a civil litigation firm in downtown Atlanta before her second retirement. She was small and straight-backed with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had been Renee's aunt by marriage until Renee's uncle passed 4 years prior, after which Celestine had kept the neighborhood walk to Darius's house every second Sunday because he shoveled her walk without being asked, and because she had told him once she thought he was a man worth knowing. She had watched a great deal. She had not said anything about most of it. She called him the Monday after Renee left. She said she needed him to come to her house on Tuesday evening after work. She said to eat beforehand. Her house smelled like coffee and cedar, and the particular dry warmth of rooms kept at exactly the right temperature by someone who paid attention to things. She had a folder on the table beside her mug. She waited until he sat down. "I'm going to tell you what I saw," she said. "And then I'm going to show you what I kept. I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything." He nodded. She opened the folder. The first entries were dated. She had been writing things down since the spring of the previous year. Dates, times, license plates, a physical description of a car that came and went from Forward Plan's Buckhead office on Saturday mornings when Renee told Darius she was doing paperwork. Celestine had been visiting her own attorney in that building and had seen it 3 times before she started writing it down. She had an organized mind and a sense of how things were going to need to be presented. She showed him the first entry. He read the license plate she'd recorded. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. It matched the plate on the car parked in front of his house when Renee's uncle had visited for Thanksgiving 2 years prior. It matched the car he'd seen through his kitchen window on Thursday night, the unfamiliar fob on Renee's keyring. Marcus Cole. He said nothing. He had seen that car before. "There's more," Celestine said. She reached across and turned to the second section of the folder. Her voice was the same throughout even, unhurried, the voice of someone who understands that information has to be absorbed in order. While Darius had been working a 4-month commercial contract in Savannah the previous year, Renee had executed a refinance on their jointly owned rental property in East Atlanta, a duplex Darius had purchased 7 years earlier and that had appreciated to an appraised value of $387,000. She had used a limited power of attorney document he had signed at a closing 4 years prior. The document had been broad enough in its language to cover related property transactions, and the title company had accepted it. She had pulled $94,000 in equity. The proceeds had gone to a joint business account at a bank Darius did not recognize, under an entity he had never heard of, Forward Plan Capital Partners, LLC, registered in Georgia 12 months earlier. The co-registrant on the LLC was Marcus Cole. Darius was quiet for a long time. He set his mug down with the same deliberate placement he gave every tool at the end of a day. He said, "Where did the rest of it go?" "That," Celestine said, "is the part that took me longer to document." She turned to the third section. Forward Plan Capital Partners, LLC had made 2 capital contributions totaling $76,000 to a separate entity, MC Development Group, also registered in Georgia. Registered 6 months before Forward Plan Capital Partners, whose sole owner of record was Marcus Cole. MC Development Group was currently under a cease and desist from the Atlanta Department of Planning and Community Development for operating a residential project without compliant permits. Marcus Cole had been the registered agent on that project. The project had stalled. The investors, Celestine believed, had not all been told the project had stalled. Darius stood up. He moved to the kitchen counter and stood there for a moment with both hands flat against the tile. The way he stood at a job site when he was looking at a panel layout and something in the load calculation wasn't clearing. Then, he walked back to the table. He stood over all of it, Celestine's documented records, the refinance documents she'd obtained through a title search, the LLC registration filings, the permit violations, the way he stood over a set of blueprints, not looking at any single piece, looking at all of it together. He could see the whole shape now, every line running from one document to the next, every connection between what he thought had been his marriage and what it had actually been, a funding vehicle, patient and deliberate, for two people who had been deciding the outcome for 11 months before he knew the game had started. He didn't move fast. That was the part people would never account for. If he had wanted fast, he could have confronted her before she'd finished moving her things to Marcus's Midtown condo. He could have called her attorney the day he received the folder and started a fight she would have been prepared for. Because she was always prepared for the version of Darius that acted from feeling. She had known him long enough to have built a response to that version. She had never seen the version that waited. He called Walter Higgins on a Wednesday morning. Walter was an attorney who had been doing civil litigation in Atlanta for 22 years. He called early, before 7, because that was when Darius reached people he was serious about reaching. Walter had done 2 small business contracts for Wade Electrical, and Darius respected the way he moved, patient, methodical, no drama in the delivery, a voice that stayed level even when the information was heavy. Walter reviewed everything Darius brought him over a 2-hour meeting. He was quiet through most of it. At the end, he said, "Before we file anything, I want a forensic accountant to go through this LLC structure." He mentioned a woman named Patricia Sears, who worked out of an office on Peachtree and had testified as an expert witness in 9 civil fraud cases. He said she was thorough, and that thorough was what this needed. Patricia Sears spent 11 days going through Forward Plan Capital Partners formation documents, the refinance transfer chain, Marcus Cole's MC Development Group registration, and the permit violation record from the city of Atlanta. She found 3 things Walter had not anticipated. The first was a second transfer, $22,000, from Forward Plan Capital Partners to a personal account registered to Renee Wade at the bank Darius didn't recognize, 3 weeks after the equity pull, categorized in the LLC's internal records as a consulting fee. The second was a title insurance claim that Marcus had filed on the stalled development project, claiming losses of $140,000, without disclosing that the LLC had received capital contributions that had funded a portion of the project budget. The third was a subordination agreement Marcus had signed with a secondary lender, using the East Atlanta duplex as collateral. A duplex he had no legal authority to pledge, because Renee's power of attorney did not extend to third-party encumbrance of jointly held real property. The total financial exposure, Walter told Darius over the phone, was not a personal dispute number anymore. It was a civil fraud number. Possibly more than that, depending on what the title insurance investigation turned up. Renee called on a Saturday evening. Darius let it go to voicemail. She called again 40 minutes later. The second voicemail was softer in tone but tighter underneath. She mentioned that she'd heard he'd spoken to an attorney, that she hoped they weren't going to make this ugly, that she'd always thought they could be reasonable people. She said she was sorry things had gotten complicated, and that she really did wish him well. He listened to it twice, not because it upset him, because he wanted to note carefully how fast she had moved from softness to pressure. The apology was in the first sentence. The threat, soft as it was in the third. He wanted to remember the exact shape of it. He didn't move fast. She had spent 6 years deciding exactly what kind of man he was. She had been wrong about the most important thing. She had mistaken patience for the absence of capability. Patience was the skill she had never had occasion to watch him use. She was watching it now and couldn't see it. He called her on a Tuesday afternoon. His voice was cooperative, unhurried. He said he thought they could resolve the financial matters without them going to court. He said he was not interested in making things harder than they needed to be. She agreed before he finished the sentence. He could hear the relief she was working to keep out of her voice, and she was mostly failing. He ended the call. Celestine was sitting across from him at his kitchen table. She had brought coffee in a thermos because she knew he'd forget to make it when he was in his thinking mode. "She thinks it's already over," Darius said. Celestine said nothing. She poured him a cup. Darius arrived at the offices of Higgins and Branch 22 minutes early on the second Tuesday of December. The 14th floor, a conference room with neutral walls, a long table, and floor-to-ceiling windows that faced north toward the city. He liked arriving early to rooms. It gave him time to understand the space before anyone else was in it. Walter arrived at 9:43. Patricia Sears arrived at 9:47. They arranged their documents in the order they'd agreed upon. The refinance chain first, the LLC documentation second, the subordination agreement third. The room was quiet except for the sound of papers being organized and the low, indifferent hum of the building's mechanical systems. Darius sat at the near end of the table and waited. They came in together at 10:03. Renee and her attorney, a man named Briscoe, who had the practiced ease of someone accustomed to settlement negotiations, where he understood the terrain. Marcus Cole was not present. Renee had not told Darius he wouldn't be, but his absence was a signal in itself. It meant someone had already advised Marcus to stay out of the room. Renee sat across the table in a jacket Darius had not seen before. She glanced at him once. A brief, professional assessment. The kind she used in client meetings when she was establishing that she was the one in control of the room. Then, she looked toward Walter as though Darius were simply a presence she was required to acknowledge. Walter opened the meeting. "Thank you both for coming," he said. "Before any discussion of settlement terms, there are several matters that require acknowledgement by all parties." He opened the folder on his left. He began to place documents on the table with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had done this many times and had never once mistaken speed for competence. The first document was the refinance closing disclosure from the previous spring, the one executed using Darius's power of attorney, transferring $94,000 in equity. While Mr. Wade was fulfilling a commercial contract in Savannah, Walter said, this transaction was executed on the jointly held East Atlanta property. The proceeds, $94,000, were transferred to an account registered to Forward Plan Capital Partners, LLC. He let the numbers sit in the air. This transaction was not authorized by Mr. Wade. A civil fraud action has already been filed. Patricia placed the forensic accounting report on the table. Walter walked through it without looking up: the LC formation, the 2 capital contributions to MC Development Group, the consulting fee paid to Renee, the timeline. His voice was the same throughout. Factual, not cold, simply precise. The transfer from Forward Plan Capital Partners to MC Development Group occurred in 2 installments over 8 weeks. The destination was Mr. Cole's development entity, which, at the time of transfer, was already in violation of city permitting requirements on the project this capital was intended to fund. Renee's expression had not changed, or rather, she had worked to keep it from changing, and the effort was visible to anyone watching closely enough. Darius was watching closely enough. He had spent 6 years watching her manage a room. He knew exactly what her controlled face looked like from the inside. Patricia placed the third document, the subordination agreement, the one Marcus had signed pledging the East Atlanta duplex, as collateral to a secondary lender without authority to do so. Walter said, "We want to be precise about what we are and are not doing here today. We are not making criminal allegations in this room. What we are doing is disclosing that this documentation exists, that it has been preserved in its entirety, that the title insurance irregularities have been reported to the relevant insurer, and that the forensic record has been provided to Mr. Wade's counsel in full." Briscoe, who had entered the room with the easy confidence of a man who had read a simple settlement file on his way up the elevator, looked up from the subordination agreement. He read it again. He set it down. For the first time since entering the room, his expression was not relaxed. He turned toward Renee. She did not look at him. The silence in the room lasted 11 seconds. Darius counted them. Walter said, "We'll allow a few minutes for your attorneys to review." Darius stood. He gathered nothing from the table. He had brought one folder, and it had served its purpose. He buttoned his jacket. He shook Walter's hand. He shook Patricia's hand. He walked toward the door. He stopped in the doorway. He turned to Renee. He said it quietly, without raising his voice, only for her, not for the room, because it was meant for her. "You didn't need me to be less," he said. "You needed to believe I was." He walked out, without looking back. It did not happen all at once. The subordination agreement Marcus had signed created a lien dispute on the East Atlanta property that required months of legal resolution. The title insurance irregularity triggered an investigation that reached MC Development Group's secondary lender, who called the subordinated loan. Marcus's development project, already stalled, collapsed entirely. By February, he had liquidated the remaining LLC assets to cover the lender demand. By March, Forward Plan Capital Partners had no capital left to partner with. Renee's consulting firm, which had run on a combination of her own billings and the operating cushion Marcus had been providing, became unsustainable almost immediately. The Buckhead office went first, then the office manager, then the part-time bookkeeper. She moved the remaining accounts to a desk at a co-working space in Midtown. By the following summer, she was doing contract administrative work for a commercial property management company, whose regional office was in the building where she and Marcus had first started meeting on Saturday mornings. She was not ruined in any public or dramatic sense. She was simply carrying the weight of what she had chosen, the way a person carries something they cannot set down, not loudly, just constantly. Darius settled the civil fraud action in March. The total recovery, equity, consulting fee, damages came to $141,000. He put $94,000 back into the East Atlanta duplex's equity position and used the remainder to pay off the company's equipment line. He promoted Roy Tatum to operations manager. He hired a 7th electrician. He answered every call the same day. He gave accurate timelines and hit them. 14 months after that December meeting, Wade Electrical was awarded its first municipal infrastructure contract, a substation upgrade for the city of Atlanta worth $2. $3 million. Darius's name was on the contract and on the hard hat and on the plans. He had 11 employees. A 12th was starting in January. Celestine sent him a succulent in a clay pot with no card, just the plant. He watered it on Thursdays. He had no idea what kind it was. He had never asked. On a winter evening in late January, Darius Wade sat on the back steps of the East Atlanta house in a work jacket with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. The neighborhood had settled into its nighttime sounds. A dog somewhere 2 blocks over, a car starting and not returning, the kind of ordinary quiet that only exists in places where things are stable. He had come by to check on the tenant's vac system. A quick visit. He had stayed longer than he planned, talking to the older woman in the downstairs unit about the work his crew was going to do on the property in the spring. She had made coffee. He had accepted it. He had sat down. He could hear, faintly, his truck running in the driveway. He had left it warm, because the drive back to Buckhead, his office was in Buckhead now, on the 4th floor of a building on Piedmont, was 20 minutes and he still had calls to return. He thought about the man who had come home to a folder on a table and a car he didn't recognize parked outside his house. He thought about what that man had believed about patience and what it had cost him to believe it, and what it had finally built. He put on his hard hat and walked toward the work. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.